I moved back to this community in 1984. Chris and Jerry's parents were our neighbors. I would hear Jerry's parents talk about them since they lived in Williston, where Chris was a nurse and Jerry worked too. Chris and Jerry moved back to this area in 1987 and became neighbors living on the homestead of my husband Bob's grandparents. Jerry started farming and raising pigs, and Chris became a home health care nurse and traveled to her patients' homes to check on them. We were all involved in our own lives, so we didn't see a lot of each other, but would run into each other sometimes. In 1994, the Howard family was having a family reunion in Crosby. The North Dakota Howards were hosting this. Chris, with the help of her two children, Sarah and Daniel, Sarah was 6 and Daniel was 2.5, were working to beautify her yard since many of the family would be coming to the original homestead to see where it all began. I remember the story of how she opened a bag of wood chips to spread around the bushes and flower beds. The children had found a little frog and were playing with that. The wood chips were not supposed to have any preservatives or chemicals on them, but they did. Chris breathed in the chemicals and became very disoriented and sick. She called another neighbor who was the Divide County health care nurse, and this autoimmune disease began the 20-year journey involving trials and error, discovery, setbacks, building faith, trusting, and healing. While not being intimately involved in all the details that happened living in a close-knit community and being a Howard relative, I heard about and experienced many of the incidents in this struggle. Chris became very sick. She was very weak and didn't remember things. She had many relapses. The original poisoning was thought to be from an organophosphate pesticide. The relapses after that were triggered by strong chemicals that had similar properties, especially those that had neurotoxin effects. There is much exposure to these in our world. Perfumes, cleaning products, anything with petroleum products in it, exhaust, sprays, herbicide, machinery running, as well as paints, flooring, furniture, scents from personal hygiene products, and scents picked up from your clothes from being around other clothes. Jerry started by creating an environment protecting her from these harmful things. I remember the neighbors painting her house with special paint. There were struggles in finding furniture without chemicals in the components, finding flooring that was chemical free, finding food without pesticides, grinding their own wheat that hadn't been sprayed for bread making. They planted gardens and canned the produce so they would have organic food. Jerry installed a central air filtration system for the house. I remember Jerry saying one time he fell on his knees before God and said that he was overwhelmed and couldn't do this without God's help. Both sides of the family were helped wherever needed, as in the beginning, Chris was so weak she spent most of her time in bed. She couldn't do anything to take care of herself or her family. Chris said one time she asked God to allow her to be able to stay home with her children. She didn't know he was going to answer her prayer in quite the way he did. She was unable to go out of the house to attend any of the programs, concert, games, or any of the activities her children attended during their 12 years in school, not even their graduations. I remember Jerry going to all these activities with his video camera so Chris could be a part of the children's lives away from the house. The neighbors would call to tell them when they would be spraying their crops, and they would have to seal up all the doors and windows with duct tape to keep the fumes from coming through. I remember some relapses occurring because of scents brought into the house from the children's coats being next to other children's coats. A separate room was utilized for things exposed to the outside world to be left in, so Chris would not inadvertently be exposed to anything harmful. Eventually, she became stronger. The relapses became less, and the family gained knowledge about the effects the symptoms, and the ways to combat the physical damage the poisoning had caused. As their knowledge advanced, they were able to allow people into their home following a set of prepared instructions. You had to bathe with scent-free products. You had to wear freshly laundered clothes with scent-free soap. No deodorants, hand creams, or anything with smells. And you had to be sniffed first to make sure you were safe. By this time, Chris's lips would tingle if she was exposed to something, and she could get away from it before a relapse became too acute. Chris was not able to go to a doctor or a dentist, as she would have not been able to tolerate the environment or the chemicals needed for a surgery or to have Novocaine. A doctor, sent free, did come to the house to give her a checkup every few years, and a dentist, sent free, did pull a tooth without pain deadeners. Chris began a women's Bible study in her home. They used this time for prayer and fellowship. By the time the Howard family held their reunion at Chris and Jerry's place in 2007, she was able to greet and visit people outside. If they were not scent free, she could visually look at a windsock and made sure to stay upwind from them and not have any tingling in her lips. She still could not be inside with people who were not scent free. They were able to build a network of others who had been exposed to and were experiencing many of the same effects that Chris was. Once a nurse, always a nurse. Chris had documented many of the incidents that happened to her in her journals. She became more familiar with products that she could tolerate. As she learned of more and more people who were in need of products that could be used, she shared her knowledge. She used her knowledge to help them and eventually developed a line of chemical-free products, which eventually turned into a full-time business. On July 6, 2013, Chris was supernaturally healed of her autoimmune disease. I know the churches and neighbors and extended family had been praying for her for many years, as everyone in the community knew Chris and Jerry and knew of her illness. During the oil boom, a family moved to Wildrose from Washington. The mother began working at Chris and Jerry's business. The prayer chain grew to include friends and relatives of these people in Washington. People began fasting and praying for them. Marcia's sister Sharon and her husband made a trip from Washington to visit, and were able to visit with Chris and told her they felt that a spirit of fear was hindering her healing. The spirit of fear was attacking Jerry. After studying God's word and prayer, the spirit of fear was driven away. Prayer for continued protection for the family followed. Chris said she had not been expecting a healing on that day, but knew right away that the Lord had taken away the reactions her body had to foods that she had not been able to eat before. Her skin felt better, and she had more energy. She was able to get in a car and go to her parents' home and show them that she was healed. She was able to go into public places and be around people with no reactions. There was also a Native American woman named Nina who worked at the business. She did not want the other workers to sing Christian songs or have Christian music playing. The workers honored her request. People began praying for her. As time went on, she asked one of the workers to do a Bible study with her. As she learned more about the character of God, she said to God she would believe in him if she saw a miracle. Then came the healing. God told her he had healed Chris for her. She put her life into his hands. God did a great miracle through the healing of Chris, but a greater miracle happened when the miracle of salvation was imparted to one who was lost and chose to follow him because of the healing. After the healing, Chris found out she had cancer. She had known she had a spot on her breast. It started growing. Now she was able to have it checked out further. The doctor said that the cancer had grown and there was nothing they could do. Things did not look good, but God preserved her life years longer than expected. Because of prayer, Chris has decided the Lord wants her to follow the plan the doctors have laid out for her. Jerry and she have been able to share her story of healing to some of the clinics and hospitals when they go for appointments. Even though Chris is battling stage 4 cancer, God has proven that he can be trusted. He is faithful in the past and will continue to be faithful in whatever the future holds. They did not know what God has planned for them, but they wait expectantly on his timing and his will. I had not known all the details or how God had used people and circumstances and what order these details happened until I watched the video Surrounded by His Faithfulness on youtube.com.